I'm a nurse at a rehab center. It's Hell on Earth Part 3. Both Todd and I finally crawled out from behind the bushes. There was nothing left at all of the woman we had heard screaming with Mr. Sinclair. Nothing except a small little drop of blood on the brick path that led back to the door to Sombra. I reached up and pulled on my hair, just needing something to hang on to so I didn't scream my head off over what I had just seen. I looked over at Todd and saw that he had another cigarette in his mouth. Your first time is always the worst. He sighed out a cloud of smoke as his cigarette barely clung to his mouth. I remember the first time I saw him do that was with my best friend Vincent. We came into rehab together. He sat back down on the bench we had been sitting on and leaned back on it. One day we ran into Mr. Gloomy over there. He motioned toward the direction of the door and presumably Sinclair. Vincent, being the dumbass he was, punched Sinclair in the face. I had moved over to sit next to Todd and couldn't help but laugh while imagining the scene. But I quickly quieted down to continue listening to him. Todd didn't seem to mind the snort I had given him. He smiled, but it quickly vanished and he looked over at me. Well, Sinclair didn't like that at all. This thing emerged from his umbrella. It looked like a skeleton dripping with tar, with these bright white eyes and, well, he let out a dry chuckle and took a long drag of his cigarette. Needless to say, Vince isn't here anymore. He sighed and exhaled the smoke from his cigarette out through his nostrils. As I took in the story he had just told me, something he said began to jog a memory. Those drawings, the ones on the sticky notes. I'm pretty sure one of them was of Sinclair with that thing he has. The doodle of the tired man with the black being behind him with piercing white eyes. It was exactly what Todd had described and what we had seen eat the woman. You're sure you don't know who this doodler is? I asked, hopeful for any information. No, I don't. I barely get any drawings from them. I know a couple of patients who get a lot. Some are cute and sweet. Others are fucking terrifying. I think it depends on who you are or what your situation is, I guess. Todd shrugged, finishing off his cigarette, dropping it to the floor, and crushing it with his foot. I looked at Todd and my concern quickly grew for him. He was the first person I'd met in this hell that I could get along with. None of the nurses seemed keen to know me, and almost every patient I'd met besides Todd had been lifeless husks. I didn't want anything to happen to him, and seeing him so thin turned my worry up to 11. I'm going to see if I can be the one to deliver you food. That way you'll know that you can eat whatever I bring you, I told him, reaching out and touching his shoulder. He looked over at me with a bright shine in his eye. For real? He suddenly was like an excited puppy as he turned to look at me, quickly wrapped his arms around me, and gave me a hug that I hadn't expected to be so strong from someone as malnourished as him. I couldn't help but smile and pat him on the back. We finally released each other and I led Todd back to his room, and I started the journey back to my room. As I passed a group of nurses, I heard their murmuring voices. They were all in the hallway just outside the employees-only section. As I passed them, I was about to scan my ID when one of them reached out and quickly shook her head at me. Are you crazy? She quickly noticed that I was a new nurse and quickly pulled me away from the metal door. Mr. Sinclair is very upset right now. It's better to stay away from him when he's in one of those moods, she told me quickly. I looked back at the metal door and felt that same incredible pressure pushing down on me that I had felt on the first day when I came across Sinclair's office. Okay, thank you, I told this nurse. She quickly nodded and turned to continue talking to the other nurses, who were all standing outside the employee-only section of Sombra. I walked away down the hall, not sure exactly where I was going. I had just wanted to collapse into my bed and melt away completely, but I didn't have that option at that moment, so instead, I just walked around the halls of Sombra. As I did so, I looked at the map of Sombra on the wall. It was there that I noticed that I was close to the kitchen where the patient's food was prepared. Without much else to do, I started walking over to it. Arriving there, I saw that it also had a metal door that required our ID badge to open. I unclipped mine from my chest and used it to open the door. I was suddenly overwhelmed by the smell of steak and potatoes. Entering the kitchen, I was completely floored by the amount of food out and ready for delivery on long metal benches. There isn't a mess hall at Sombra. The patients are allowed to eat in their rooms and get 3 full-course meals a day. I looked around at all the plates with steak, vegetables, and mashed potatoes all ready to serve. They seemed endless and were all laid out on the benches that felt like they went on for miles. "Nurse Cassie," Nurse Taylor's voice asked me, catching me completely by surprise and nearly giving me a heart attack. I spun around to see that she had just entered the kitchen behind me. "What are you doing here? I don't believe you're scheduled to work in the kitchen." She looked puzzled. "Oh, well..." My brain worked overtime to try and think of an excuse to tell her. "Mr. Sinclair is upset and in the employees-only section, and I wanted to eat something. So I thought it would be okay if I came here to eat something," I told her, hoping that my lie was enough to convince her. "Oh, yes, of course, dear." Taylor nodded and motioned for me to follow her. "It's best for you that you don't interrupt Mr. Sinclair when he's in a mood such as this," she explained to me, leading me past all the prepared food and into the kitchen proper. "Pick whatever you'd like from back here. All the food on those tables has already had the patient's medicine applied to them," she explained to me. I stared back from over the counter of the kitchen and swallowed a lump in my throat. All that food for all the patients here. And it was all drugged. I was so glad that I hadn't just picked up some food from the table and given it to Todd. Nurse Taylor walked over to the dishes that were piled high in the sink and pulled out a plate for me. I took it with a small thanks and quickly began to fill the plate with some steak and veggies. "Thank you, Nurse Taylor. Would you mind putting some saran wrap on this? I wanted to eat this in the garden." I handed her the plate with all the food I had added to it. Taylor stared at my filled plate with a raised brow at first, but she simply shrugged and took it from me. "Of course, dear. Here, I'll show you where it is." She walked over to it and showed me where several rolls were in a cabinet above the hood of the stoves and ovens of the kitchen. I thanked her quickly, took my plate back, and started to wrap Todd's food up. I thanked Nurse Taylor again, and after grabbing a fork and knife from the benches, I quickly left the kitchen. I sighed in relief as I held the plate close to me and quickly made my way back toward Todd's room. This time I made sure to knock on his door before I just entered it before alerting him to my presence. His door opened and he peered out from inside it a little, before quickly flinging it open. "Oh hey, I didn't think you'd be back so. Is that food?" He flung his door open and quickly took the plate from me. He scurried over to his bed like some sort of creature, and I couldn't help but let out a little giggle as I watched him rip into the plate of food, struggling slightly with the saran wrap. "I made sure that this food wasn't contaminated with medicine," I told Todd as I watched him rip into the plate like a wild animal. He grabbed at the food with such force that everything but the steak turned into mush with the force that he was grabbing and squeezing it into his mouth. "You're the best, Red," he mumbled through mouthfuls of food. Seeing him with so much food smeared across his face grossed me out and made me smile. I walked over and sat with him in his bed, licking my thumb and starting to wipe some of the schmutz off of his face. He flinched away and kicked up a fuss about me cleaning his face. "Oh, hold still," I scolded him, sounding exactly like my mom when she babysits the neighborhood kids. Todd grunted in annoyance but finally relented and let me clean up his face. "What do you do with the actual food you get served?" I asked, handing him his fork and knife so he didn't have to eat with his bare hands. "Oh, I flush it down the toilet," It's got a super powerful flush since a couple of patients have clogged them in the past. Me included. He snickered as he struggled to cut his steak with the crappy plastic knife. I drink water from the sink and steal food from the nurses. He grunted as he kept cutting into the steak. I'm sorry, Todd, I told him, feeling immense regret that he was in this situation, and I just couldn't believe that nothing about what was happening here at Sombra had ever leaked out into the public. Sombra Rehab Center is a renowned and beloved institution here in New England, and yet, the truth was so much worse. Before I could spiral any further, Todd tapped me on the shoulder. I looked over at him and saw that he was presenting me with a cute little scrunchie. I thought you might like this. Keep all that red hair nice and safe. He mumbled. I noticed as his pale face grew slightly red, and judging by how hot my face was getting, I bet I was just as red as my hair was. Thank you, I told him, taking the scrunchie from him, removing the hair tie in my hair, and fixing my mass of red hair into a bun in one swift motion. Where'd you even find this? I asked, watching him shove more food into his mouth. I have my ways, he mumbled through a mouthful of mashed potatoes and steak. Before we could continue our conversation, however, a loud alarm blared out from the loudspeakers mounted on the walls. I quickly covered my ears at the high-pitched scream they were emitting. All nurses! Taylor's shrill voice broke through the alarms. Report to the lobby immediately, she shouted through the intercom. I quickly stood up and waved goodbye to Todd as I sprinted out into the hallway and toward the metal doors separating the lobby from Sombra proper. Quickly swiping my ID card and opening the metal doors, I was met with an army of nurses all standing at attention. I quickly shoved my way amongst them and followed their leads. Thank you all for assembling, Taylor told all of us as she stood up on the receptionist's desk to be able to see above all of us. I couldn't help but feel out of place amongst all these nurses. Every one of them had a look of unquestioning dedication and almost looked like they were part of a military unit or something. I felt immediately out of place amongst all of them. I called you all here because Mr. Sinclair has a very important message for us. Taylor clapped her hands together like she was a preschool teacher announcing to her class that it was time for recess. The other nurses all joined her in clapping for Sinclair as he climbed up onto the receptionist's desk. Nurse Taylor quickly scurried away as he did this and joined the rest of the nurses in clapping for Sinclair as he pulled his suit jacket down and straightened it back out. He held up his hand to stop the nurses from clapping, and they soon quickly all stopped. I thought that making all of you nurses would give you women the opportunity to do something useful to society. And yet you have all disappointed me. Sinclair's voice was dripped with nothing but venom. I couldn't help myself from getting upset over his words, and he'd only just begun to speak. In the past month, patient suicides have risen by almost 30%. I don't think I have to tell you women that this is completely unacceptable. The nurses almost all looked down at the floor in shame. It's not our fault, sir. One of the other nurses spoke up. I looked over at her and saw that other nurses had also looked over to see who had dared to speak up. These conditions are dash. Before she could even finish her sentence, the creature I'd seen with Sinclair suddenly appeared from the floor and grabbed her by the throat, lifted her off of the floor, and carried her over to Sinclair. From this moment onward, Sinclair explained as the poor girl thrashed and gagged. The tar-dripping creature gurgled at her like it was laughing at her. It then unhooked its jaw and took a giant bite out of the nurse's face. For every patient suicide, one of you shall be sacrificed. Do I make myself clear? The creature ripped chunks out of the poor nurse, with disgusting chewing noises joined by sucking as it seemingly slurped all the blood out of her body before eating the final few pieces of her. I gagged and had to use all the muscles in my throat to stop myself from throwing up. Some of the other nurses weren't so lucky as a few of them threw up on the floor. While we didn't answer Sinclair, it was clear that the message had gotten through to all of us. The creature, having finished its meal, slithered over to Sinclair and took its place behind him. It was then that I noticed that Sinclair wasn't casting a shadow from the bright lights in the lobby. That creature was his shadow. One more thing. Many of you are new and haven't had the opportunity to meet Spencer. Sinclair pointed into the crowd. I followed where he was pointing and saw that sitting in one of the lobby chairs and reading a magazine was a man with a facial mask and hoodie. He flipped through the magazine and looked up after he noticed everyone was looking at him. He held up a peace sign to us, which revealed that he was also wearing latex gloves. He is a business employee of mine, and as such he will be allowed access to all of Sombra. Dismissed. Make your useless selves some sort of helpful. He waved all of us away as his shadow produced a cigar for him. I had to fight the urge to run away out of the front doors of Sombra. I followed the mass of nurses, and while many of them quickly made a beeline to the nearest patient to ensure that they hadn't hurt themselves in some way, I quickly returned to the employees only section and went right to my room. I felt like a zombie after what I had just seen. It had been bad enough seeing the first bite and then hearing the shadow creature eat that girl in the garden. But seeing it happen was so much worse. I couldn't help but picture the scene of Todd ripping his teeth into the steak I had brought him. I wobbled over to the bed, collapsed onto it, and finally released my emotions, crying uncontrollably into my pillow. I hadn't even bothered to take off my glasses. Everything in Sombra had been a lie. This wasn't a rehab center. It was and is hell on earth. Looking up from my snot-filled pillow, I was suddenly met with another sticky note drawing. Sniffling and reaching out for it, I took my glasses off and quickly wiped the tears off of them. Placing them back on my face, I was surprised to see that the doodler had left me a drawing of what appeared to be the man Sinclair had introduced as Spencer. He was holding up a peace sign, but his arm was completely made of bone. More writing was on this drawing, and I brought the sticky note as close to my face as I possibly could. And to my shock, I found that it wasn't gibberish. It was very tiny writing. "Drug man?" I asked in confusion. Those small little words would prove to be more true than I could have possibly imagined.